curtailment is a strategy that will be woven into the economics of Bitcoin mining for the foreseeable future, for decades to come, and it'll become a greater part of the strategy in future.
During a recent heat wave that drove electricity prices to extreme levels and threatened the stability of the power grid in Texas, Bitcoin miners in the state voluntarily curbed their operations. This action was taken in response to the high prices and incentives to conserve power, and it resulted in reduction in power usage that potentially aided other essential services like residential air conditioning, medical centers, and municipal water systems. The extent of the shutdown and the precise amount of power saved was unclear, but these curtailments were confirmed by the industry participants and the ERCOT, the grid manager. So what does that mean?
Yeah, Bloomberg was on this. They wrote an article about it when we hit a record high of 80,000 and some change megawatts of demand in Texas a few days ago. We're probably going to hit another record today, 80,300 megawatts. What we saw is participation by the Bitcoin miners to such an extent that ERCOT publicly commented that the miners were being helpful and were following the price signals as they should, which typically does not happen. Typically, ERCOT will wait for an after-action report a couple of weeks before they say, yes, we do have enough data to show that this was helpful. They were able to comment in the moment, which is better than in the past. Of course, we won't know the exact number of megawatt hours curtailed. Currently, there's about 2,200 megawatts of Bitcoin mining in Texas, so there's no possible way that all of that could be curtailed, but we do expect that in the next couple of weeks, we're going to see significant curtailment. Now, some people have used that as an opportunity to say Texas is not the right place to mine Bitcoin. And in reality, this is just going to be part of the mix moving forward. Curtailment is a strategy that will be woven into the economics of Bitcoin mining for the foreseeable future, for decades to come, and it'll become a greater part of the strategy in future. Right now, you may have 95% uptime, 98%. You're only curtailing for a few hours this week, a few hours the next week. But in the future, it could be that with so much solar in Texas, our peak or our peak demand, or actually our lowest spread between the amount of megawatts in physical responsive capacity, PRC, and the demand could actually be smallest between the hours of like 6 p.m. and 9 p.m. So that, even though that's not the hottest part of the day, that's when the solar starts to come off. So that actually might be that time frame where miners are curtailing. So it's a good story.
So one of the things that jumped out to me the most was the fact that ERCOT commented, and I'm not familiar with their strategy with media, how often they comment, but it sounded like that was rare that they would do such a thing, like what you just said. But do you think that has to do with the politicking that's out there and how right now there seems to be kind of like a war on crypto and all things blockchain and Bitcoin and Texas Energy, et cetera?
I think ERCOT tries to stay oblivious to that. I mean, they obviously see it happening, but they put some blinders on and try not to pay attention to that.
So going back to the energy and the heat wave, we were on a call recently with from gentlemen, and we don't need to say where they're from, but one of the things they brought up was like how a place in like a desert that maybe uses a country that uses desalination for their water is potentially a huge Bitcoin mining could be a huge resource for them just because of the battery aspect, because there's points in the year where they have a huge overflow in reserve of energy that's just wasted. So when I heard that, it immediately made sense and how that kind of correlates with Texas, because yes, once every 4 or 5 years, don't quote me, there's a freeze, but every year there's a heat wave.
Yeah. And so you have different kinds of demand profiles and load profiles for different regions of the world. Not only is that time of day or season of the year, but as you mentioned, it can also be driven by external factors in the economy, like desalination in places in the Middle East and North Africa. So absolutely, you have a ton of excess power, especially from these generators, or excuse me, these natural gas turbines that are spinning and generating power for desalination for a portion of the year, and then for maybe 9 months out of the year, they're less active, and so there's a lot more power capacity that's available. So absolutely, it's a good story to follow, and I think it's going to be the top of mind for Bitcoin miners throughout the world, but in Texas in particular.
In speaking of Texas in particular, it seems like this subject matter, and I don't know if it's because I live in an echo chamber, but this topic is one of the foremost topics that's always talked about. Is it because energy is so unique here with ERCOT, or is it because we have a large Bitcoin mining presence, or is it a combination of all of it?
I think it's a little bit of both, but primarily it's because we're having to push back against the FUD from, I'll say, maybe the radical or the ESG movement, not the ESG movement in a whole. I think there's a lot of people in the ESG movement that are actually pro-Bitcoin and understand how this innovation is actually bringing about a smoother transition to more renewables. But there are proponents within that industry that are trying to shine a spotlight, and so we're forced to respond. And so we need data, measured responses, data responses. So the more that we get yelled at, the more that we can show data, we'll look like the adults in the room.
And just jumping into the comments, this is a flag to wave to show the ESG camp that Bitcoin mining does in fact help the grid. Can you briefly explain what the ESG camp is?
Yeah, so we've got some comments here coming in, and so the ESG camp, again, like I said, is not completely against this. There's a lot of great ESG Bitcoiners, Troy Cross and Jen Urso and many others. I always use her Twitter handle because it's just easier to remember than Margot. So Margot Paez, I should say, and many others. So what's happening here is the progressive left is looking to have a scapegoat for why the energy transition is not taking place as they surmised. And the primary reason for that is because of the duck curve and the fact that wind and solar are just not base load generation. And they are not capable of meeting the demands of a society. And so Bitcoin mining is coming in there and helping even out and shave off the peaks and bring up the valleys of the duck curve. And that is also, and the location agnosticism of Bitcoin mining is also helpful because you can put it behind the meter next to a facility that maybe was built out for 50 megawatts of solar, but you add that Bitcoin miner as a consumer or a customer right there, and you could perhaps build out double that.
And then you brought up the duck curve. Can you, and I've heard you reference it a lot, and maybe I'm just not brave enough or I forget to ask, what is that?
Yeah, so as those on YouTube can see, we've brought up an image of it. The duck curve describes how the energy demand looks when you chart it on a graph. So we use a lot of energy when we're waking up in the morning, 8 a.m., 9 a.m., and then it curtails off in the middle of the day, and then it peaks quite a bit at the end of the day. And if that matches up with your generation profile, that's great, but it never does, right? Because wind and solar don't follow the same patterns that we do in our daily rhythms. And natural gas is pretty steady, but natural gas generators are having to really eat low energy prices for those moments when there's spikes in prices, and they make most of their money in, like, it's the whole 80-20 principle, except for natural gas, probably 95-5 principle. They make most of their money 5% of the year when there's elevated prices, and the rest of the time they're losing money.
So I appreciate the questions and commentary. It looks like two of these are going to be similar. Ben was asking how's at the grid, and the curator was kind of answering that. I think I'll let you respond, but I don't think ERCOT is ramping up production when they need the power. I think in ERCOT just producing power, and the miners are ramping up the supply, and then they can bring down when they're not needed.
Well, so it's a beauty of a free market when you have a price signal. ERCOT's really not producing power; they're just the grid operator. So they are dispatching power or dispatching their ancillary services when they need people to curtail, they are communicating with generators who are watching the price and generating power when it's economical for them to generate. So Bitcoin miners are also watching that price, and they're mining Bitcoin when the price is low, and then when the price theoretically goes above, say, it depends on the hash price and depends on price of Bitcoin and all that stuff. But when the price goes above $100 a megawatt hour, then they would curtail. Now that is, again, like I said, a moving number.
Right.
It moves minute by minute, but it's in a range of, say, $75 to $250 a megawatt hour. And you might see miners curtailing a little bit later than $250 a megawatt hour because of some hosting agreements that they have. If they're not self-mining, if they're hosting, then they have some agreements, and so that causes them not to curtail. Or because if they're air-cooled, they're worried about their machines, and so they will have that. The price will have to be a little bit higher for them to curtail because of the opportunity costs of curtailing with maybe a 1% damage rate to machines every time you curtail. That has a significant cost to it. So you need that energy price to be higher. You need to recoup more, either savings or energy credits if you have a forward power hedge in that high-priced environment for you to justify turning off. So that's why the numbers can be upwards of $250 a megawatt hour sometimes.
Hey, it's Amy. Click over here to subscribe, click over here for more content, and we'll see you next time.